So I think that's 2 minutes. So I think we can start. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining and thank you for having me here. This is really a great honor. So this particular topic, the importance of a sprint goal, is actually kind of dear to me as well because I actually had a goal this year to actually speak at an event, and I'm actually finally getting an opportunity to do that. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is definitely going to apply to you both personally or probably in your Scrum teams as well. And there is going to be everything about inspection adaptation in this particular conversation. So what I want to first touch upon is some basics of Scrum. So yeah, basically the Scrum framework and what professional Scrum is. So all of us are familiar with the essentials, which is the 3 roles, 5 events, and 3 artifacts, and the rules that are associated with Scrum. And typically, if you implement just this, you can call it Scrum, but it is not professional Scrum. Scrum also has an aspect of empiricism. That is, you bring transparency over your work, transparency over the process, and how that transparency will help you inspect and adapt. One more important thing is the 5 Scrum values. So the 5 Scrum values, empiricism, and the definition of done and your sprint goal all together, and an emphasis on using the right terminology is professional Scrum. So this is important for us as we go into this conversation because why is the sprint goal important? What does the sprint goal have to do with like empiricism? What does it have to do with Scrum values? Are some of the things that I want to talk about today, right? So what is the sprint goal? According to the Scrum Guide, the sprint goal is an objective that will be met within the sprint, and it is done through the implementation of the product backlog. Okay, so it is an objective. It helps us focus. It helps us understand what we need to achieve. So we'll get into a little bit more details of that. But first, I also want to bring attention to this one particular image that I found on the internet. And this is actually Ken Schwaber's own words that, Scrum, basically what it says. And Scrum basically points out your problems. Now, why is this important in the context of a sprint goal? I'll get into that as well. So when you implement Scrum, the common question I normally hear is, well, how do we do this in Scrum? How do we manage this in Scrum? And the answer to that is typically there is really no good answer. There are good practices that we can follow, but Scrum will reveal the problems that you have in your teams or in your process. And you as individuals working in that Scrum team need to figure out or be creative to use those revelations to make those changes that will help you become more effective in software development, or as we know that Scrum can be used in other things as well, to be more effective. So the moment you implement Scrum or any part of Scrum, you are going to see that if your process is not effective, then these problems will come immediately to the surface. And that is exactly why I want to stress the importance of a sprint goal. The moment you apply a sprint goal or start using a sprint goal, some problems or some symptoms that teams normally face will definitely surface up. So let me get into the next slide. Okay, actually, before I go into that slide, let's talk about this. Keeping this particular statement that Ken Schwaber says, let's look at some of the examples that I have gone through where I have seen the sprint goal bringing some things or making certain things transparent. So I used to work for a large bank before, and when I was Scrum Master on that team, one of the biggest challenges I had was to help the team craft a sprint goal. Okay. Now, I don't know if some of you had the opportunity to attend one other session today. It was regarding component and feature teams. And believe me, when I started trying to craft a sprint goal or help the team craft a sprint goal, what I noticed is that we could never come up with a sprint goal. One of the challenges we found, or whenever I asked, what do we need to do this sprint, everyone used to give answers like, oh, complete all the high priority stories or everything that we selected for the sprint. But what are we focusing on? That element of focus was always missing. What did we want to achieve? What outcomes did we want to kind of like validate at the end of the sprint? That was always missing. So I asked the team, hey, you know what? Why aren't we able to craft a sprint goal? You know, how, and when we craft a sprint goal, how can we be more focused? And the answer that I got is that we cannot do this. This is not how our teams work, because we have dependencies on other teams. So essentially what I learned in that process is that we were trying to build something, but we were all divided into separate teams, component teams essentially. And each component had a scrum team, and they were basically handing off work. So they couldn't truly, any of these teams that were at these components couldn't truly create a done increment. So their sprint goals often sounded vague because of those reasons. So the moment you craft a sprint goal, and if you cannot create a done increment that meets your definition of done, then maybe it's quite possible that one of the symptoms is that you're probably a component team. So this is something that I wanted to bring awareness to. And and finally, what happened as a result of that is that we had to self-organize, and we had to look at all the skills that we needed in order to kind of like reduce these dependencies. So when in this particular example, in this particular context, if you apply a sprint goal, what you can see is that you can eliminate some of the dependencies, provided you align your teams in that manner. Okay, so that's one context. I worked in another company as well, and in this particular case, crafting the sprint goal revealed another issue, and that issue is, okay. Let's see how this team was formed. So they want to go through an agile transformation. They want to have Scrum teams. Okay, all good and well. But when they formed the Scrum team, they didn't look at what they wanted to build. Why are they forming the Scrum team? What are they trying to do was not clear. So when they initially tried to create a sprint goal, what they realized is that their sprint goal cannot be coherent. Or when I say coherent, as in they could not create one that would cause all the team members to work together. Everybody was working on different things. So why was that? The reason for that is because they were more project focused than product focused. And what happened there is that they had two separate products, and they were calling the whole thing, they kind of like formed a team around these two different products, and they were trying to tackle that, but it was not going to work because they wanted to do both these, they wanted to work on both these products at the same time. So when we couldn't craft a sprint goal, what we did is that we started asking questions. So what is our product? What is our product vision? What do we want to achieve? And when we started asking those questions, there was transparency over the situation. That transparency helped us identify, oh, okay, we are basically having two products. So now that we have two products, then what we need to do is basically split up the team, ensure that there are the right skills on both sides, okay, so that we can address the development work. And the moment we did that, we were able to craft good sprint goals. I hope I'm conveying the message right. So we were able to craft good sprint goals, and that immediately showed us why what that kind of like resonates back to the essence of Scrum. When you implement Scrum, it will not solve your problems, but rather it will reveal the problems. And when it reveals the problems, you need to act upon it so that you can resolve those issues. So in this is a clear example of when we saw the problem, we identified what we needed, we split into two teams, and as a result of that transparency, we were able to solve the issue that we were initially facing. So that is another reason why we need to use sprint goals, or sorry, a sprint goal. Okay, so how does the sprint goal tie back to our Scrum values and Scrum events? Let's start with the sprint planning. So the sprint goal is crafted during the sprint planning event, and it is created not by the product owner, not by the development team, it's created by the entire Scrum team, collaboratively. They discuss what needs to be the product owner can come with an idea what he or she needs to achieve, but then it is the collaborative effort of the Scrum team to decide what they can achieve in that time box that they have decided. It helps us understand why exactly are we taking this sprint. So let us the common cadence that many of the teams follow, what I've observed, is 2 weeks. So if you have a 2 week sprint, what do we want to do that is so important that will deliver value to our customers, and what can we achieve in that 2 week time box? That should be the guidance for forming a sprint goal. The moment you form a sprint goal, then that 2 week time box is dedicated to achieving that sprint goal. So it helps us bring, so if we have a product or if we have a vision, what the sprint goal does is it brings us one step closer to that vision, because it creates alignment with the vision. How can we start bringing the ideas and the value that our vision is supporting? How do we bring that out? So every time we create a sprint goal, we are bringing our vision. We are inching closer to our vision. And the sprint goal is not something like it that is output focused, or in the sense like just take a bunch of product backlog items and do it. It should be outcome focused. What are like I said, when we are in sprint planning, what are we trying to achieve? Why is this important to us? Why does this excite us as a team? Why does this excite our stakeholders? When we go into sprint review, what are we going to demonstrate? How will our stakeholders interact with the increment, with the product? What are they going to see? Why are they excited about the sprint? And that is what sprint planning essentially does. It helps bring that kind of transparency. The sprint goal brings transparency over why you're undertaking the sprint. It helps you move in the right direction. So now the sprint goal also gives the development team some flexibility. Now, what does that mean? And I want to try and explain this with an example. So let's say that I worked for companies that use e-commerce. So I'm just going to use an e-commerce example. So one of the companies that I worked for, they wanted to build a marketplace. Now, for the marketplace, they wanted to enable customers to make payments online. So enabling users to make payments online can be considered a sprint goal, because the outcome that we are trying to achieve is allowing our users to pay online. Okay. Now, paying online could be achieved in different ways. You can use credit card, you can use debit card, you can use direct bank transfer, Apple Pay, whatnot, PayPal. So all of those are different ways you can do it. Now, depending on the capacity, depending on what the team can forecast as to what they can achieve, they can use the goal as a guidance to select those product backlog items which it believes it can achieve in that sprint. So let's say for example, they took payment using credit card or debit card, and let's say they took all the 4 examples that you can see on the screen, right? If they took all the 4 examples, and let us say that they were able to achieve only the credit card and debit card, does it mean that they didn't meet their sprint goal? No, it's not true. Even if they just met just the credit card and debit card, they have still met the sprint goal, because by implementing the credit card and debit card functionality, they are allowing users to make the payment. So I think someone asked a question when is that to sorry to Quinn is that can we add more product backlog items to the sprint? Yes, you can add more product backlog items to the sprint if it does not endanger your existing sprint goal, and if you can create a done increment. It gives you the flexibility to put more product backlog items into the sprint. But the primary purpose of sprint planning is to create the goal so that we can understand why we're undertaking the sprint and what is the forecast that we're going to develop. So this is how the sprint goal will help during the sprint planning event. It brings transparency over the work, creates shared understanding. Everybody knows what we're trying to achieve. Okay. So let's move on to how the sprint goal helps in the daily scrum. Now, in my experience, so the daily scrum is an interesting one, and I think the sprint goal is more helpful in the daily scrum. And in the absence of a sprint goal, typically, in my experience, what I've seen is that everybody or the team development team members essentially talk about what they did, and they don't focus together as a team. The sprint goal should actually unite the team. So let me give you an example, right? When you look at any sports team, right? If you tell them to win the game, they're all going to work towards winning the game. Or I don't know if you guys are familiar with the game of cricket, and I'm using this not because of I'm a huge fan of cricket, but generally after one team plays and after their innings are over, when the second team has to win, they have a number that they have to chase. That goal of getting at least one run or 1 point more than the opposing team in order to win the game is what drives all of them together, not as individuals, not as separate team, but the whole team works together to get to that score. So in the same way, the daily scrum, or in the presence of a sprint goal, the daily scrum should be something like that. How are we progressing towards the sprint goal? What progress are we making? Not individually talking about I developed this, I tested this. No. How as a group are we progressing to our sprint goal? Are we closer there? What is the confidence that we have that we'll achieve it? And that is where the inspection and adaptation comes. Actually, not just inspection and adaptation. When you actually discuss this during the daily scrum, keeping the sprint goal in mind, how are we progressing towards it? One, as you discuss, you're bringing transparency over the situation. Second, as you bring transparency over the situation, you're inspecting your sprint backlog, and you're looking at what are the next things that you need to do. It also gives you an opportunity to adapt your plan, because the sprint backlog is a plan and a forecast of what you're trying to achieve. So what does your forecast look like? Something like today's weather. Like, do you see yourself with a high confidence of achieving the sprint goal, or has anything changed? Has more scope come in? Do we need to bring any issue up? These are the things that will come up when we kind of like inspect our progress towards the sprint goal. If you don't have a sprint goal, what will happen is that, like I mentioned, you will just talk about what we did yesterday, what we did today, and just move on like that. But we'll never talk about how close are we towards achieving that outcome. So the sprint goal is very important here. Also, during the daily scrum, so most of you must have read the Scrum Guide, and one thing that the Scrum Guide talks about is in the case the sprint goal becomes obsolete, then the product owner can cancel the sprint, right? So if you look at it from that perspective, every day the development team inspects progress to the sprint goal. Anything that causes it or causes an issue, or let's say endangers a sprint goal, that information comes up immediately. And if that information is such that you don't have it makes a decision, or it causes a decision that you don't have to proceed with the sprint anymore, then you can cancel. If the market direction changes or the sprint goal becomes obsolete, then the product owner has a decision to cancel the sprint. So in this manner, when you inspect your progress toward the sprint goal, you're also kind of like mitigating risk, because it allows you to check whether you need to continue with the sprint or if you need to pivot. And all this talk about Scrum is back to agility, right? And if you look at one of the values of agility, it is respond to change versus following a plan. The sprint is a small plan, time box to 2 weeks or whatever the time box is, right? And if the plan doesn't make sense anymore, you can respond to the change. How do you respond to the change? Using the sprint goal. Does it still make sense to pursue this outcome? If it doesn't make sense, well, come together as a team, see if you need to proceed with it, and if not, cancel the sprint, move on to the next thing. So it's definitely helpful with risk mitigation. Now, what about the sprint review? How does the sprint goal help over there? Again, it brings transparency over what we achieved during the sprint. It helps the stakeholders inspect the increment and see if they have received the necessary outcomes. Again, I stress a lot on the fact that sprint goals are outcome driven. They're not output driven. It's not about how many product backlog items or user stories you completed. It's about, did we achieve a specific outcome? Does that outcome validate what we were trying to do? Does it give value to our stakeholders, right? So that is exactly why we have a sprint review, to validate, to basically inspect if we met, to inspect and validate if we met the desired outcome, if it makes sense to continue working on this product. So again, the sprint goal helps over here. And then finally, the sprint goal at the retrospective. So the retrospective is basically an event for the team to think about how it did, how it did as far as a process, etc. But it's also a good opportunity to check how do they have all the skills to have met the sprint goal? Did they have any weaknesses in meeting the sprint goal this time? Do they need to do anything to make future sprint goals more successful? So the sprint goal can be used as a mechanism for self-improvement as well. So if you look at this slide alone, you can see that there are several things that came up. The sprint goal helps us focus on what we need to achieve. It helps us, it brings transparency over the situation, over the work. It helps us inspect and adapt. So those are the pillars of empiricism. Now, I want to give some more examples. We talked about the Scrum value of focus coming in. Now, when we create a sprint goal, and that is coming back to the sprint planning event, right? It is collaboratively created by the entire Scrum team. Why is this important? This is important because so typically what we've seen in traditional organizations is somebody tells you how to do work and then they just pass it on to you, right? Or they pass it on to the developers. But in Scrum, we are talking about collaboration. We are talking about working together as a team. So collaboratively creating the sprint goal gives the development team some ownership. So it is not like the product owner is coming and just saying, "Oh, take this," or "I'm assigning you work." No, the product owner, the Scrum Master, and the development team all together are coming and they're discussing what they need to achieve. So the development team also has a stake in achieving this goal. So because they have a stake in achieving this goal, what happens is that they commit to the goal, to achieving the goal. And that is another value of Scrum. So people commit to the goals of the team. And in this particular case, people commit to the sprint goal, or the development team members commit to the sprint goal. They don't commit to the product backlog items selected for the sprint. They commit to achieving the outcome of the sprint, that is the sprint goal. So we have focus, we have commitment. Now, I think that someone mentioned, what if some additional work comes in and all that stuff. So typically when you have additional work or scope coming in, that's absolutely normal. But what we need to do, or as a development team or as a Scrum team, how we need to look at it is, okay, we can take in the additional work, but does it affect our sprint goal? Does it endanger our sprint goal? If it endangers our sprint goal, then the development team members can demonstrate the value of courage. They can be open up, they can be open about what they can achieve. They can demonstrate the value of courage, and they can tell the product owner that, hey, you know what? We can try this, but it's possible that we may not be able to finish it. It is also possible that if we focus on this, then we may not be able to finish what we initially planned. So focus, commitment, courage, and openness. All these four values come to life. Now, when the sprint goal becomes obsolete and if the product owner decides to cancel the sprint, everybody respects that decision. So now you can see that the five values of Scrum came to life. You can see that empiricism is always there because of the sprint goal. And this is the essence of Scrum. Not just three roles, five events, three artifacts, and the rules, but the values and empiricism. That is what makes Scrum, or the heart of Scrum, beat. So the sprint goal definitely brings all these things to life. So this is what makes the sprint goal very important. Even though I've seen teams that they know that they need to use a sprint goal, but sometimes they ignore it and they don't use the idea of a sprint goal to facilitate change. So definitely worth considering. If you have a situation like this in your organization, if you're trying to form a sprint goal, or if you're not using a sprint goal, then definitely see what challenges are surfacing as a result of you're trying to create a sprint goal. Are you component teams? Are you not looking at the proper product? Is your vision unclear? Are you in alignment with the goals that you're trying to achieve as an organization or for your product? So these are things that will definitely become very transparent the moment you start using sprint goals. I'll take a pause there and just go to the next slide. So I just wanted to, I mean, I must have covered this, but here are some examples of sprint goals that I have seen and some from my personal experience. The bad sprint goals primarily. So in my example where I told you that I did work for a large bank, um, the the first time I actually asked the development team to create a sprint goal, that was the response I got: complete all the high priority stories. And when I asked again, I was told, okay, let's just complete all the product backlog items selected for the sprint. So these are two classic examples of how people create sprint goals. You cannot say that in a way, you cannot say that that cannot be considered a goal, but it is very vague. It does not focus, it does not create the right amount of focus. What are we committing to? When you say high priority stories, for example, or high priority backlog items, right? How do you know which is high priority? And if it is high priority, what about the others? Should we stop focusing on that? So that tends to give a more output-driven approach than output-focused approach rather than an outcome-focused approach. So same goes with the example of fix all the bugs, right? Okay, so what is a good sprint goal then? What? So it takes some time. I'll be very honest. Sometimes when you start writing a sprint goal, when you try to craft a sprint goal, it's not easy. It takes a little bit of effort, but as you practice it a bit, it'll become more organic. And I've seen teams that, like I said, I gave you an example of a team that I worked that initially could not differentiate between their products. But when they differentiated their products and they were able to work and start creating sprint goals, they did struggle. It's not that from day one they created perfect sprint goals. They did struggle. They eventually got better with their sprint goals, and with the right amount of feedback, they were able to create measurable, specific, and focused sprint goals or outcome focused sprint goals. Now, if you look at the three examples that I have provided over here, the third one is actually what my team worked on, which is reducing the number of calls to the call center by 20%. So this is for one of the current companies that I'm working for. It's an insurance company, and the insurance company does receive some calls for their, you know, insurance applications or insurance policies. So we were receiving a large number of calls, and we needed to actually figure out what are some of the different channels we can use to reduce the call volume. And this was a sprint goal. So if you look at the sprint goal, it's very specific. It says we need to reduce the number of calls, and we are aiming for a percentage as well. We have a measurable metric. So if we were able to implement, or if we are able to implement the functionality correctly, then did we really reduce the calls by 20%? If yes, then we achieved our sprint goal. If no, then we didn't achieve our sprint goal. And does it matter if we didn't achieve our sprint goal? No. The sprint goal helps us focus on what we need to achieve, and that drives us constantly, motivates us. So if we didn't achieve it, it's an opportunity to inspect and adapt. Again, like I mentioned at the retrospective. Another example that I've seen for the e-commerce company that I worked for was basically to reduce the checkout time, enabling online payments. So these are also very good sprint goals. The three ones that are listed on the bottom are good sprint goals because, like I mentioned, specific, measurable, and outcome focused. If these three things, and if it also answers the question, why are we undertaking the sprint? What are we planning to do? What value are we delivering? If those questions are answered, then most likely you will be able to craft good sprint goals. I think there's some static or noise. Okay, thanks. Okay, cool. Moving on. Some common questions that I receive around the sprint goal. So the first question I obviously get, and I think this question came up in the myth or fact as well: is the sprint goal mandatory? Yes, The sprint goal is definitely mandatory. It brings the values of focus and commitment to life. And most importantly, the sprint goal is very important, and I would lean towards mandatory because it causes the development team members to work together. Remember the example of any sports team? When they have a goal to win, they work together. And the sprint goal is exactly that glue that causes all the development team members and the Scrum team to work together towards a common outcome, towards that specific outcome they need to achieve as a team, not as individuals. The goal is bigger than individuals alone. So yes, the sprint goal is mandatory. And just a fun fact, right? The sprint goal actually appears in the Scrum Guide 27 times, which kind of like which kind of talks to the importance as to why you should consider the sprint goal as mandatory and important. Another question that I get quite often is, can we have multiple sprint goals? So this comes from the perspective that, hey, my sprint goal for this sprint is actually uh, does not require the entire length of the time box. I can achieve my sprint goal in less than the time box that we have. So can we have multiple goals? And usually it stems from that. But what happens after that is that that becomes a practice to include multiple sprint goals. So my opinion and my advice to you would be, try to avoid using multiple sprint goals. A sprint goal is outcome focused, and it does not cause you to think multiple, it does not shift your focus in multiple directions. If you have multiple sprint goals, then what will you be focusing on? Which sprint goal is more important to achieve? If you have two sprint goals, do you focus on sprint goal one or do you focus on sprint goal two? So the Scrum value of focus is effective if you have multiple sprint goals. So the best thing to do is create one sprint goal. If you have additional work, bring it on, check what your capacity is, forecast what you can do with it, and bring it on into the sprint. No problem. But ensure that by the end of the sprint, whatever you're taking is built into the increment, it meets your definition of done, and it is potentially releasable. If it causes your existing sprint goal to be endangered, the best thing is to stay clear, not do it, rather than having multiple sprint goals, because you probably would end up in the same place if you have multiple sprint goals. You would not be able to finish one, you'll not be able to finish the other one as well. So having one focus sprint goal is very important. So finally, do all the product backlog items have to be part of the sprint goal? This is a very good question, and as I've been answering some of these things and as I've been talking, no. The answer to it is no. All the product backlog items need not be part of the sprint goal. The sprint goal will encompass certain product backlog items. Those will those will help you achieve the sprint goal, but you can have additional scope or additional product backlog items which can be part of the sprint. As long as your sprint goal is met, as long as you don't endanger the sprint goal, you can pull in additional work. Even if it is middle of the sprint, during sprint planning, it doesn't matter. As long as you have capacity, as long as you have the ability to take on that additional work and create it and put it and create a done increment, you can, and as long as it does not endanger the sprint goal, you can definitely take on. So finally, I just want to kind of like go over some of the things that I've said, and hopefully after that we can run into questions. We can basically get into questions, and I don't know, and I hope you guys got something out of this. So some of the key takeaways that I'd like to talk about. So if you look at the entire conversation, we probably are at an agreement right now that the sprint goal is very important. But what are some of the key takeaways for me, and some of the key takeaways that I feel that I need to let my audience know is the sprint goal creates focus. The primary purpose of the sprint goal is to create that focus on what we're trying to achieve. It brings the Scrum values to life, right? It brings the Scrum values to life, as we just saw through the multiple examples. Now, one other important thing that I'd like to specifically call from this list is the sprint goal helps mitigate risk. Now, risk is mitigated using other factors as well, other elements in Scrum as well, but sprint goal helps mitigate risk. Are we progressing towards achieving that outcome, or is this outcome still necessary? If the outcome is not necessary, do we still need to continue? So if it does not make sense to continue anymore, we are cutting the sprint short, we are canceling the sprint, and we're reducing the risk by that much. If you don't have a sprint goal and if you're not able to inspect and adapt or inspect your progress towards it, what will happen is that you will take on some additional risk, and later on, if you find out that, oh, this does not make any sense anymore, then it's too late. You've spent money, you've consumed the time of the developers, right? So that will how does that affect the value of respect? For example, if we don't know if we need to proceed forward, right? So, so sprint goal is a good risk mitigation mechanism, is what I would definitely want to convey. Then the sprint goals are, again, another thing that I would definitely focus and reiterate on is sprint goals are outcome focused. It is always outcome focused. It's never output focused, and output means, delivering, uh, 20 product backlog items, or 20 stories, or 10 stories, or whatever it is. That is output focused. Outcome focused is, for example, have I enabled a customer to pay online, or have I reduced my call volume by 20%? Have I improved something? Have I reduced something? So those are outcomes. So sprint goals should be outcome focused. And if they're specific and if they're more focused and measurable, that is also good. The sprint people commit to the sprint goals, and this is very important. Many times I've heard, in my experience and on the ground, when I talk to managers or generally with Scrum teams, they talk about the sprint backlog as being a commitment, but the sprint backlog is not a commitment. People commit, or the development team should commit to the sprint goal, not to the sprint backlog. So that's a very important thing to know. Okay, and one very important thing is, and I want to kind of like, it it basically takes me back, to my childhood and when I was in school. So I don't know how many of you can relate to this, but generally when we played in the streets, or generally when we played at school, what would happen is that, our instructors would just give us a ball. So I used to play basketball. So they just used to give us a basketball, and that's it. So we are a bunch of people, bunch of kids. Uh, we get a ball. We want to play the game. What do we do after that? We basically toss a coin. We kind of like, actually, yeah, we basically, select who is going to be the captain of the team. Okay, then we toss a coin to see who's going to start, and then the captains get to choose who the players on the team are going to be, and that is how we used to form our teams. Okay, so why I'm bringing that example is because the sprint goal is actually a mechanism for the development team to self-organize. When we talk about self-organizing teams, the sprint goal is one of the elements, or one of the things that teams can self-organize. So this is very important, that, if you have a sprint goal, you can self-organize. How do I need to align my skills? What are the communications that I need to make? What are the preparations that I need to do to achieve the sprint goal? How do we as a team need to manage our time? So this is all self-organization. So sprint goals will help with self-organizing, or self-organization. Sorry. So those are some of the key messages that I wanted to kind of like convey today. I'll leave the space open and take any questions right now. Um, and if not, we're done with today's session on the sprint goal. And I just hope that the messages that I conveyed are helpful, and it'll encourage you to use a sprint goal if you're not using one already.
Hi, Steve.
Hey.
Hi, Steve. My name is Lam. I have a question related to the sprint goal. Um,
Mhm.
but first, I would like to say sorry for asking this because I know that the sprint goal is mandatory, and I also heard about the benefits of the sprint goal that you share. But
Mhm.
in some case, will cause any a negative impact if we don't have the sprint goal. Because to be honest, some product owner don't think that the sprint goal is really valuable. Like the product owner thinks that we also have the scope, the like the dev team can commit to the scope of the sprint, so we don't need the sprint goal. So what should I do to show the PO the value of the sprint goal, or maybe
Okay.
cause any negative impact if we don't have the sprint goal?
Okay, so I'm not sure about your very specific context in depth, but I just have a quick question. Are you the Scrum Master on the team?
Yes, to be honest, I'm a scrum master.
Okay, okay. So the question you asked is really good. So what should you do, right? So again, as I mentioned, the sprint goal helps us focus on what we need to achieve, and the sprint goal brings the Scrum values to life. It helps with empiricism, right? Now, one thing that the Scrum one as if you look at the responsibilities of a Scrum Master, the Scrum Master is responsible for the development team, to the product owner, and to the organization. And in the Scrum Guide, it does say that the Scrum Master uh, teaches and promotes Scrum in places where it is not well understood. So emphasizing the importance of a sprint goal, why we need to have a sprint goal, how it helps with focus, this how their development team should commit to the sprint goal and not to the sprint backlog are some things that the Scrum Master can emphasize on, and the Scrum Master can teach the product owner, not just the product owner, but also the wider audience, the development team, maybe the organization. Maybe this is not very clear in the organization. So a Scrum Master can teach Scrum theory and talk and emphasize on why the sprint goal is important, how it helps bring the Scrum values to life, and why those are important. Does that answer your question?
Okay, thank you for your advice.
I'm sorry.
Thank you for your advice. I got it. I got it.
Okay, awesome.
Thank you. And I have a question that regarding to Swingle. In case my PO just want to set up a Swingle, something like release features A successfully, and is it a good Swingle? Because I have heard that Swingle should relating to something to the business, so should bring the values to the business.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting here, Steve, but the main room session is now starting the closing session. So for everyone that's not in this question, please go back to the main room already.
Okay, so let me see if I understood your question. So you're saying that currently you're creating sprint goals that are not business focused. Is that what it is?
Sorry.
So I don't think I quite understood your question. Did you mean that the sprint goal that your product owner is currently creating is not business focused? Is that what you said?
What I said that I just wonder for a good sprint goal that does it need to release only for the business values? For example, like I will bring new features to help the customer to use it successfully. I can focus something to fix the problem from my team to release successfully is enough. It means that a good sprint goal.
So implementing a functionality. So if it is part of your product, if it's part of your product vision, yeah, and if it is part of your product, implementing a functionality can be considered a sprint goal. So for example, I'm trying to relate to it. Let me know if that's not what you meant. So for example, let us say that I have a website that does not accept online payments right now. So implementing online payments is a functionality, a new feature, or a new functionality that does not exist right now. So by doing that, yes, that implementing that online payment option is a sprint goal. If it is something that we can achieve in that time box that we've selected, the time box that is common amongst in your case, in that time box, can we achieve it? Then yes, that is considered a sprint goal. So keep in mind that when you form a sprint goal, it should be outcome focused. Can we say that have we achieved this? Yes or no? Have we reduced something? Is it measurable? Okay, did we achieve that? So why are we undertaking the sprint? If you can answer these questions, then typically your sprint goal will address those two things. What are we trying to solve? Why are we undertaking the sprint? What outcome should we see? So keep those questions in mind, and if you can form a sentence or a goal, that should be a very good sprint goal.
Thank you so much for your good advice.
Yeah, no problem.